of the trees regarding our gender identity and sexuality. When there's no place like home, empty air, an empty establishment. Friends with Dorothy, fighting for your civil rights. Out on the cruel streets tonight.
My pleasure to introduce Leah and the rest of the panel. Leah is going to take it from here, and Eamon and everybody else, and introduce everybody. But we're very pleased to have this session today to introduce you to everybody, and I'm going to hand it over now.
Thanks so much. Falterof, you're also welcome. Our panel is titled, forgetting his mic for creating the nice intimate atmosphere here. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. My name is Lisa Nic, and my pronouns are she, her, and the title of our panel today is The Challenges and Success Stories of LGBTQIA plus Publishing in Ireland. We're looking at lots of different things as part of that with our esteemed panel, who I'll introduce shortly. But I think Eamon, who was the chief organiser and lead on this panel, would like to say a few words to begin with. Eamon?
Hello, can you? Oops, there you go. Is that any better? No. Firstly, I want to say how important it is to me to be sitting here talking about my experience of being a queer writer. I've wished for this opportunity for many years. So thank you, IDLF. I have trouble getting the letters in the right order, for facilitating this event. And indeed, thank you, Lisa, Ger, and Mary, for agreeing to sit with me to discuss the important issues I hope we'll touch upon today. It was in 1970 or 71, I was attending a writing course at the People's College in Liberty Hall here in Dublin. And the group was discussing a short story I'd written about the friendship between a Christian brother and one of his pupils. A man called Nick said it was the love that dare not speak its name. It was several years before I understood this was a quote from Oscar Wilde, and several more years before I realised all my stories could be described in the same way. Like Sally Rooney, I was writing about what I knew, although in my case, apparently without knowing what I knew. Indeed, had been writing queer stories before I learned there was any such thing as a person being bisexual or gay, as we now understand those terms. But immediately I knew that's where I belonged. In addition to my novel, I've had stories published in UK literary magazines, have won or been placed in a small number of competitions, and even had a Pushcart Prize nomination from the US. But except for 2 explicitly LGBTQ plus publishing opportunities, I have been entirely unsuccessful in attracting any attention to my fiction here in Ireland, which I have found frustrating. So much so that in 2010, after getting a 3rd rejection from this particular Irish literary magazine, I wrote to the editor, and I quote, "I don't suppose you are likely to acknowledge that homophobia or a heterosexist view of the world played any part in the decision to reject my story. You will insist that you publish good stories that fit in with the magazine's ethos. You will also reject any suggestion that the magazine has any responsibility to help integrate into general literature the stories that emerge from minority groups," referring to the funding they were receiving from Corleone, the Arts Council. This was 3 years before Panty Bliss got into trouble with his remarks on the Late Late Show. So you can imagine how well my comments were received. When the correspondence ended, I was left in no doubt that I would never be published by that magazine. Nowadays, lots of lit mags say in their mission statements that they are actively looking for stories written by people from underrepresented groups. Post-Panty, things may have changed, but in 2016 I attended a panel discussion entitled "Magazines, and their makers here in Dublin, and asked the 5 or so editors on the panel if they received many LGBTQI plus submissions. Only one person took up the topic, and I paraphrased their reply. When we first started our magazine, we got quite a few, but lately they have dried up. There was no elaboration, but I assumed that the reason they dried up was because they were not being published. I hope to be proved wrong today.
Thanks, Aidan, and thanks to all of you for joining us for this panel. As I say, we're looking at, I suppose, the good, the bad, the ugly of publishing of LGBT authors and of queer representation, I suppose, in the text that we read and the text that we write. So there's kind of the two sides of that. There's LGBTQ publishing as regards ourselves, the authors, the writers, and then the text that we're reading and the characters that we read in those stories. So our panel will be sharing some of their own experiences, and Eamon's given us a flavour already, and some advice for anyone who might be looking for ways of being published themselves, and this may go across the board for people who are LGBT or not. And we'll also talk about, as I say, queer representation in those texts, libraries, bookshops, and all of the different facets of this story. So we hope that you enjoy it, and we'd love for you to engage with us as part of the Q&A that we will save plenty of time for at the end. I promise I will be cutting off our wonderful writers to make sure that you can kind of engage with us and maybe share your own stories or make some comments about what you've heard or ask some questions. So we'll have plenty of time for that at the end. Before we start, I just was listening to a beautiful podcast during the week that I wanted to mention, and if anyone hasn't heard it, it's called Invisible Threads, and it's run by LGBT Ireland. And on that podcast, basically it's older queer people sharing their stories from, I suppose, about our history, about literature, about all sorts of things. And Brian Lacey, who wrote Terrible Queer Creatures, Homosexuality in Irish History, and documented much of that history, was speaking about queer literature and representation, and he said something that really stood out to me as I was preparing for this week's panel, so I just wanted to share it. He said, at the time, looking back to, I suppose, darker times for LGBT people in Ireland, at the time we had no words for it. We had nothing to read. And that was before the podcast host had even mentioned books. But it just shows the importance, I suppose, of books at that time. And as they continue, you know, being able to read about something, I suppose we'll talk about later, you can't be what you can't see. And I suppose having characters in books, on TV shows, and now on iPads and apps, we need that representation of all minority communities, so that people within those communities, young people in particular maybe, can feel that they can achieve that too. So that's a flavour of, I think, what we might be touching on today. But firstly, I'm going to introduce all of the members of our esteemed panel. To my left is Ger Moane, who is a writer, psychologist and shamanic practitioner. She wrote Gender and Colonialism, a psychological analysis of oppression and liberation, and has been an activist in feminist and LGBTQI plus communities for many years. Her fascination with Newgrange has inspired her creative writing, and she has published fiction and creative non-fiction about ancient Ireland. Her forthcoming novel, Winter's Sun, is set at the time of Newgrange and imagines an ancient Ireland where people live in harmony with earth and the sky, and gender and sexuality are fluid. She's a former lecturer in psychology at GCD and is producer of the award-winning documentary, if you haven't seen it, I strongly encourage you to, Attitude, the Irish lesbian community. Ger, you're very welcome. Can we get a round of applause for Ger? And beside Ger is Mary. Mary Dorcey is a writer and a poet, a pioneering feminist and an LGBT activist, and the first openly gay woman in Ireland. She joined the Irish Women's Liberation Movement in 1972 and was a founding member of Irish Women United, Women for Radical Change, and the Movement for Sexual Liberation. She has published 10 books, 7 poetry, 3 fiction, and was elected to the Aosdána, the Irish Academy of Writers and Artists, in 2009. Mary's work has attracted international research and has been the subject of academic essays and critiques. She's won widespread critical acclaim for her portrayal of romantic and erotic relationships between women, the cathartic role of the outsider, and the nature of erotic power to subvert and transfigure. So we're all down to read more of your books now, Mary. Mary's books have been reproduced in more than 100 anthologies representing Irish, gay and women's literature, and is taught at universities throughout Europe, the US, Canada, Africa and China. And she's now a research associate at Trinity College, where she conducted contemporary English literature seminars and has led a creative writing workshop during her 10 years as a writer in residence at the Centre for Women and Gender Studies. Mary. And finally, what will I call him? I think our Taoiseach, our leader of the panel, Eamon Summers, who is the reason we're all here today, and also to Lawrence, of course, for hosting us. Eamon was born and grew up in inner city Dublin, where we are today, quite aptly, I think. And he was a campaigner and spokesperson for Ireland's fledgling lesbian and gay rights movement in the 1980s. During the mid-80s economic downturn, he was made redundant, and having moved to London, he spent almost 2 years coinciding with the Anti-Clause 28 campaign, working in Harney's lesbian and gay unit. He then joined the charity housing sector, where he worked until his retirement in March 2019. And Eamon's short stories have been published in various journals, and his debut novel, if you haven't seen it, I recommend having a read, Dolly Considine's Hotel, which is set in Dublin in 1983, was published in July 2021. So Eamon, delighted to have you too. And what's interesting going through those bios, I think, is that I think we've got a panel of maybe 4 activists in our own right, and it's interesting that as writers, as LGBT people, sometimes you become an activist, and I think what a lot of younger activists now are calling it is an accidental activist, that maybe it wasn't something that you intended, but you become it. So to start, I think we might just ask you all a general question, give you all a bit of a moment to share your stories. Could you tell us a bit about your experiences being published as LGBTQ+ authors, and I suppose as LGBTQ+ readers as well, from a young age, from when you started, right up to where we are now? That's not too big a question. Ger, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, a big question. So actually, I will go back. I mean, because as we all said, in the 70s, there was nothing to read or write that we would be aware of. Oscar Wilde was probably the best known person. And it just wasn't a concept, and the idea of looking for lesbian or gay literature or queer literature wasn't in the arena either. In my personal experience, it was coming to feminism that opened my eyes, and through that was a lot of women's presses in the 70s and 80s and 90s even. In the UK and the US, among other places, there were presses, and still are, devoted specifically to queer writing, and in particular to lesbian writing. And that was my first introduction to what you might call queer literature, and that ranged from a sort of romance-type stories that were very commercial and written just to entertain, to more literature style. And a lot of the writers I first came across were American. Dorothy Allison would be an example, who were fantastic writers, but trying to find somebody that would reflect my experience, wasn't going to happen at that point. So that's as a reader. Then I went into academia, and I wrote a lot there and published a lot on queer stuff in the form of essays. Some of them were academic publishers, and some of them weren't. And I think with that experience, that's a great experience. I mean, being in an anthology with other queers, that experience, which my first time was in the 90s, it was a great experience. It was also quite frightening, actually, I remember at the time, because even though I was out and I was in UCD and I was very secure, you could argue, economically, in the early 90s even, it was still difficult to come out, and to come out in print was a whole other step, because that was, it may sound really weird looking at it from this perspective in 2023, where people are proud to be out, but maybe put it in perspective by saying homosexuality was still criminalised until 1993. So an edited collection of out LGBT people was actually the first. There had been a previous one called Out for Ourselves, but that was in the 80s, but the writers didn't actually give their full names. They either gave pseudonyms or first names, because at that point, even people working in community and activism didn't want their full names out in print. So that'll give you an idea of the difficulties of writing and publishing right through the 90s, I think. So then I started writing. I can't say I have written a lot of fiction. I've written a lot of non-fiction, but not a lot of fiction from a queer perspective. My novel, as you just described, it is speculative fiction, which is a genre, if you like, that is not terribly easily published. It's set in ancient Ireland at the Neolithic time, and that's partly my own interest in. I'm just fascinated by Newgrange. And yes, I did set up to write something that would be gender fluid. And initially I had the idea of writing completely gender, non-specific characters, but I just gave up on that because it's enough of a challenge trying to write a novel set in the Neolithic without. But the gender fluid idea, I mean, my idea was that your gender wouldn't determine your place in society, which I still think it does, and that it would be a much more fluid, open, non-gender, fixed kind of society, and that sexuality would be fluid. It wouldn't matter if you're gay or straight or queer or trans or whatever you were, because the whole society was so. It is exactly. It's an idyllic, but I believe possible. Where actually it doesn't determine your sexuality, your gender identity, your gender. It doesn't determine your life outcomes or your life possibilities. It's other things like what you know. That was a great experience writing that actually, and I finished it. I didn't have success. I went to about 4 Irish publishers and just got. I mean, I got what's called positive rejection, which is lovely. We're very interested, so but go somewhere else. Or ambitious, even I was told at one time. Like, okay. So at this point, I am working with a publisher, and I'm very hopeful that that's going to come through. But I've been around the scene. Time to stop now. But I've been around the publishing and literary, or whatever word you want to use, the Dublin scene. And I think the publishing world is very, very difficult and very, very challenging anywhere. I'm just speaking about Dublin and Ireland, very much so. Very small, very contained, very competitive, way loads of people. Compared to academic writing, at some point, it did take me about 5 years to figure my way around the academic system, but once I did, you know where to go and so on. It's very well resourced, very highly structured, a lot of feedback, a very manageable world. Whereas I would think the publishing fiction, or whatever we want to call it, fiction, creative non-fiction, poetry, short stories, all of that world is very amorphous and difficult to find your way around and dominated by certain stone people, and it's just a very difficult world, I think, to negotiate as a writer looking to publish. And I can't say I've had a few rejections myself. I know what it's like. Fortunately, I was old enough, but if I hadn't had my quote-unquote successful academic career to go, I'm not, to actually look back on, I think I would find it much more difficult. So I'm hopeful that anyway my novel's going to be on the table by January or February, and I look forward maybe to next year being able to say the published
We look forward to it, Ger. It'll be great. Thanks, Ger. Mary?
Hello everyone, it's lovely to see you all, and it's lovely to be here. I'm a bit rattled this afternoon because I had a very bad experience out on the street that I won't go into the details of, and so drugs and poverty are more on my mind for once than lesbian and gay exclusion. And it's nice to be rattled for a different reason. Where do I start in my life? My first book came out in 1982, and I have it here because it's such a sweet-looking little book, Kindling. It was published in London by a lesbian feminist collective, 7 brilliant, most of them American women living in London, 3 of them Jewish, which was great and is very relevant to the fact that they were as radical as they were. And I had been, let's see, where do I start? I went to university in Paris, and I had a French boyfriend at that time. And I don't know how I wound up. One of my lecturers took me to a special light show one night, just at the end of, I was about to go home in a week's time. Anyway, long story short, I realised she was gay. And I had never seen so many beautiful, fascinating people in one room before. And as soon as I saw them, I thought, these are my people. I didn't know why or how, but I had always known that I was looking for something different, that my life was not going to be ordinary, and I could never explain to people what it was I was looking for or how it was going to become extraordinary. So then I come home to Dublin, and within a week, you've heard the story before, I'm walking up Grafton Street at night, and there's a poster on a lamppost saying, "Sexual Liberation Movement meets tonight, Trinity College, Dublin." And I went straight over. So that was the first, we literally met for the first time, the first gay group in Ireland in, what year was it?
74.
73. So within a few months, you know, we were beginning to have protests and publishing this, that and the other, and making a nuisance of ourselves. And I was invited to the first, I think it was the first Women's Week at UCD, and I stood up and said, I'm a lesbian and proud, and people just went absolutely crazy. They were supposed to be discussing sexuality, but they were expecting to discuss it from an academic point of view, and there was one I won't mention her, she's a very good woman. She was a practicing psychiatrist, and she spoke about it from the psychological point of view, and that's what people were expecting. So for me to say I'm a lesbian and proud of it, so people had come prepared, and I was bombarded with rotten fruit and paper planes and actually sticks and stones, literally some of them, and had to be led out of the room at the end of the evening. But anyway, it certainly radicalised me right there and then, you know. I don't know why I wasn't frightened and intimidated, you know, but I just thought, fuck the lot of you. And I still have the speech that I wrote because I was staying with my mother just for the weekend, it wasn't normal. And I wrote a speech that I was going to deliver. So it was the last speech I've actually read, but I read it that night, you know, and I said to myself, I'm going to get through this speech, you know, it's the last thing I do, you know. So that was UCD at that time, and then the next thing was Irish Women United, and you've probably all heard about that. It was the second, there was the Irish Women's Liberation Group that I went to briefly, but nobody was talking about sexuality there, and I brought up the subject of gay sexuality, and everyone went, ooh, you know, and that was including Nell McCafferty, who became a great friend afterwards, but Nell was going on about marriage and how we all want marriage, you know, we all want marriage, you know, which, you know, you could say was foresighted of her. But there was no gay representation at that time. But it changed very quickly, and there were, well, I don't know, about 7 gay women then within about a month.
Sometimes I say
You were one of them. I think it was 7 to start with, and we were very influential. And within that group, completely free to speak as we wanted and completely accepted as central members, because most of the time when Irish Women United is written about now, it's talked about as we're all these separate little covens, you know, the Republicans and the right-wing Republicans and the left-wing Republicans and so on and so on, and the crazy gays, you know, and it actually wasn't like that at all, because we needed each other so much, and the sense of camaraderie was fantastic. And I remember that to this day, the power of those groups. You know, there was an average of 100 women, and at any Sunday meeting there would be, you know, 25, 30, 40, and always a woman at the back saying, I'm just an ordinary woman, but. So one of my poems that has become well known was The Ordinary Woman, and I wrote it maybe, I think around 82 or something, and it was to put those women on the map, you know. All those women who for years were saying they were ordinary. Anyway, an American press, English press, they were American women, but they were in London, got in touch with me and said, would I consider allowing them to publish a collection of my poetry? I've been publishing little bits here and there. I said, well, and as it happened, I was going to live in London anyway, you know. I've moved all over the world. For a long time, I was never anywhere for more than a year. So off we went with my beautiful lover of the time, Carol Duperel, who you remember, the most extraordinary, extravagant and interesting and beautiful and absolutely shameless woman, you know. It was impossible to embarrass her, which was fantastic. And she's an extremely proper French mother, you know. And she said, of course, Marie, I have nothing against gay sexuality, you know, but not for my beautiful daughter, you know. That was her point of view. Which was a lot better than a lot of the Irish ones, because the difference was that, you know, at least you could say the word, whereas in Irish families, and I was always being asked why everybody in Ireland says, oh, it will kill my mother. And I remember Carol saying to my mother and to me once, when we'd been together around 5 years, why is it all Irish women, especially Irish women, you all get drunk at the end of the evening and then you start talking about your mothers? And it's always what you can't say and what you can't do because of your mothers. But I'm rambling from the point. I went to London and I brought out Kindling, and I brought it just because I say it's such a fragile looking little book, isn't it? And it sort of started a storm in Dublin. And even, and this sounds unbelievable, so I won't name them, but it's true, when I went to read from it in a Dublin pub, there were about, I don't know, 25 women there, you weren't one of them. And there were some very well-known kind of left-wing, far left-wing people who also happened to be gay. But anyway, they heckled me the whole way through and made it impossible for me to read at all. You know, they were banging their pints on the table. So, you know, there was just nowhere you could turn in Ireland at that time. There was nowhere where you could count on getting support, because I think these left-wing women, who I still know, of course, I don't know what the problem was. They basically thought if you weren't talking about the Provost and Republicanism, you were just a liberal, you know, this was a big distraction. I think that was the attitude. So anyway, me and Carol thought we better get out of Dublin, because I have to say that in London, you see, the culture was totally different. You could go anywhere and it was just like this, you know. People actually listened and everybody was very polite, and there was no heckling, there was no shouting, there was no abuse. So when I came back to Dublin, my God, it was tough, and it's getting tougher. What happened to me today? It's getting tougher, but for different reasons. So Carol and I went to live in Kerry, and that's a very long story that I can't get into, but we ended up opening a restaurant because she was a fantastic cook, and she was on her way to France, and we had already lived in America, I think, and she ran restaurants there, and we started a restaurant in Dingle, meaning it would be for a summer, and I stayed 8 years and she stayed 10. And when I was there for the first time, because we had this really super quiet little cottage in the middle of nowhere, I said to her, because I hadn't been writing in between, because I'd just been fighting to make a living, to make a living, and fighting to be openly gay, which was always a problem. Not in Kerry. I have to always say that in honour of Kerry people. And they all knew right from the start, oh, the girls now, you know, all the girls, you know, always the girls, oh, you're great girls, you know. And then they all wanted a job for their girls in the summer, you know. And there was one wonderful family with 6 beautiful daughters, one more beautiful than the other. And all the mothers would come down at Easter and say, would you have a job for the girls? Would you have a job for the girls? And salmon, okay, I need prompts, right.
Just because we expect your experience.
Okay, all right, okay, yes. So I'm down there and I'm writing, and I bring out my short stories, so I'm getting on to salmon, and published again by Only Women Press, and to my amazement that won the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature, and I have no idea why. I had no influence, I had no connections. I just got a phone call one day. But because it was published by a tiny press, they couldn't republish it for quite a long time, and they couldn't afford even to put one of these little stickers on it, you know, that says Rooney Prize winner. And all the other Rooney Prize winners got that, you know, they got a lovely gold and whatnot on their cover. So to hurry along then, I don't know when salmon came into my life, because I was publishing poetry again. So when would that have been? Would it have been the late 80s, I think. And that was at a time when no Irish publisher would touch me, and that included the one gay publishers in Dublin, who I shan't name. I mean, they weren't officially gay, they were feminists, but it happened that they were all gay. And in a very memorable phone call, one of them said to me, and I understood her point of view totally, I don't have any bitterness about it. She said, Mary, we just can't afford it, we just can't do it, it's just too dangerous for us, you know. And, you know, families didn't know they were out and all this sort of thing, and they'd lose the bit of funding they had. Anyway, salmon, and the wonderful Jessie Len Denny, who has to be praised here, because she's supported me ever since, and because she's American, she didn't give a damn, you know, about gay shockability or anything else. And she has backed me all the way, and she's published all my books since, and published, as you know, hundreds and hundreds of wonderful Irish poets, and American. She publishes people from all over the world. But she is the most open publisher. She's an ardent feminist, and she had set up the first writers group in Ireland way back, I think, in the 80s, you know. And I think I better stop there, will I?
Well, I don't think I have very much more to say. I think I said it all in my introduction. Yeah. So I think move on to the general questions.
Any of your own experiences, though?
Well, I just think that
The bad and the good.
The bad and the good. I think within Ireland, as I've said, it's I found it very difficult to have any notice taken of me. I published in Out for Ourselves, and I didn't think I was. I'm certainly thanked in the foreword. So although
yes.
I may not have been named in my piece, I was certainly attached to it. And then in the mid-90s, Queer Fellas, which was a collection of Irish gay fiction, was published, chaired by Brian Finnegan, who at that stage was the editor of GCN, Gay Community News. But as I say, these were, I was invited to do those because it was a gay, both were gay publications. So it was, I didn't have to fight against anyone else or be competitive or anything like that. I could just say what I wanted.
Thanks so much to all of you, and I find it quite profound and quite moving when I think about the work that people like the three of yourselves did for my generation, for the younger generations. I'll be getting married to my own beautiful girlfriend next year, and we sometimes forget that only 8 years ago we wouldn't have been allowed to do that in this country. And the battle goes on, and in smaller ways, where I'm going on a podcast tonight to talk about the heteronormativity in the wedding industry that I never knew existed until I jumped into it, and maybe people don't talk about it enough, but the amount of times we have been called the bride and groom or Mr. and Mrs. So that's, things go on in all different ways, and things are much harder for a lot of people in our community, for trans people, for non-binary people, and so on. So the battle is not over. Maybe thinking of that, Ger, can I ask you about queer representation? The importance of it, representation of ourselves as writers, as we write the text that we do, whatever it is we're writing about, and then queer characters in what we write. Again, if that's not too big a question.
Yeah, no problem. Well, obviously that's a huge topic, the question of representation and who we see, how we see ourselves, and in literature. We focus on that. And just to put a few parameters, first of all, because I did realise I was going to be asked this, but I'm going to focus mostly on novels, but there's also obviously short story, poetry, creative non-fiction. There's the range of different kinds of creative writing. Then there's the question of what do we mean by LGBTQ queer? What is a queer writer? And that itself is a panel, and it's been a topic that has been developed and elaborated over the last 20 years. I mean, it was lesbian, gay, then bisexual, LGBT, then transgender, LGBT, then it's in AII, intersex, and so forth. The kind of understanding of sexual orientation, sexuality, gender, and gender identity has just been elaborated so much that I think that's why we use the word queer really in one way, because it's a simple one word to capture all that complexity. So that's the complexity of the queer piece. And then what about Irish? I thought I will focus on Irish, but what's Irish? What does that mean? So is that people born here, Irish American? I mean, once we go into that, we're also into a whole set of questions about identity and labels and politics and so forth. So having said all that, I thought thinking about it in my own experience, and I don't want to get too specific with naming names, because actually what I did do is, or these friends of mine were having this conversation, is there an Irish lesbian novel, or is there queer writing, or what is queer writing at this point? Somebody looked up Goodreads. Is that what it's Goodreads? Yeah. And they do have a list, actually. And it is interesting. Yeah, you are. I just saw Catherine O'Donoghue and Mary Dorcey's on it, yeah. But also, so is Sally Rooney and Anne Enright, just to name two. So that raises questions about what we're talking about. So my first thing I thought was, look, let's get what I started reading myself and loved and would still read. A lesbian author, lesbian world. So you're in a queer, you're in Dublin or London or Boston or whatever it is. You're in the gay world, which is kind of the kind of world I live in. Most of your friends are, it's that what we might would have called lesbian world, and it's written by somebody who's an out lesbian author. And that's, if you like, one sort of form of representation that is incredibly important, I think, to know that there is such a thing, and what is that world like, who lives in that world, what kind of characters there are, and how do they interact, all the kinds of stuff that we like to read in fiction around our own world, which is me saying my own world. And of course there's also gay writers who write about gay world and so forth. And that's, in a way, that's been around for a long time, I think, because 70s, 80s, 90s, there were a lot of publishers who specialised in that area and were gay publishers or were lesbian publishers. A lot of whom have gone to the wall, as have gay bookstores and women's bookstores, because the publishing world and the book-selling world has all become hugely amorphous and has incorporated, some would say assimilated, all the minority voices. So black bookstores have closed down. Yeah, well, I'll leave you to talk about that. So that's one of those. Then there's a queer writer with queer characters who writes more mainstream, about a mainstream culture, a mainstream story. And one that comes to mind, Hilary McCallum has a great novel, a woman who's a lesbian, it's called Gold Digger. She leaves Ireland during the famine, goes to the States, becomes part of the travel out west. And within that, when all the characters are around her, are normally straight, normative, whatever, and the world is the world of people emigrating to the west coast, she has that character within that. And I actually love that form of fiction, and she's made a very strong case. We should all be writing historical fiction and rewriting lesbian and gay characters into historical fiction, because we've always been there. And of course, a lot of historical fiction would leave that out. So then the third what I'm talking about is somebody who's a queer writer but doesn't write queer and doesn't want to. And, writes romantic fiction set in Brighton and wouldn't make reference or wouldn't be particularly noticeable within her book or his book as to whether the characters are, he would deal with mostly straight characters, but the author is LGBT and may even be out. That's a kind of a grey space for me, because I kind of think, why wouldn't they write a bit more explicitly? And I think we got some of the answer to that from the earlier discussion, which is that it's very difficult to do that, and it has been very difficult to do that. But I know plenty of queer writers who just don't have an interest in writing in a queer way. But at this point, I think we'd have to be asking, why is there not a queer character in a novel? And that brings me to our next category, which is, I'm going to have to, I don't know what quite word to use, because the LGBTQIA plus community has spent decades developing our language, and we still only have one language for somebody who is, dare I say it, heterosexual. Or straight. So I always feel very straight, queer, but anyway, somebody who doesn't identify as queer. We still only have the one word for that, and I really think we need to address that. But that would be Anne Enright, who has a fully gay character in her novel. Sally Rooney has gay and bisexual.
I have to.
Yeah, okay. Well, they are. They are. In other words, I'm sorry to use the word straight. I just wish I had a better word. But would have that character. And Sebastian Barry is another example, and that's becoming, I think, probably more and more. In fact, where I think we're going, and I'm going to represent, is that we're getting to the point where, as I said, it would be, why haven't you got a gay character or a queer character? Because we've already got that with TV. We've got it with film, we've got it with TV, we've got it with streaming, we've got it with Netflix. In the last, I'd say probably 2 years, maximum 5, it's virtually unknown for me anyway. Now, we obviously choose our programs, but we don't look for gay programs. But a lot of the mainstream is now including a gay character or a lesbian character or a couple. And that includes Irish mainstream. I'll just name one, Marion Keynes would automatically have a lesbian couple living down the road as part of her big panoply of characters and whatever. I think pretty well every mainstream Irish writer is going to drop in the character like that. And that's where I really think it comes to representation. Is that okay? Of course it's okay in one way, but how do we, how bland are those characters going to be? How worked out are they going to be? How much are they going to deal with the issues of being queer or gay, such as coming out, homophobia, losing your job, loss of love, all kinds of things. Which brings me to a final question, which is, with the world that is so amorphous now, what is uniquely gay, and what would you be looking for in representation? Because after all, we all have heartbreaks, we all deal with our sexual development, we all have complicated romantic relationships, we all have neighbours. All the things that are in mainstream fiction is part of our experience. So if it gets to the point where there's a gay or lesbian or queer character in every novel, just as a matter of course, because we are supposedly 10%, where is that going to leave us all? But I think that's where we're going. But the other things I will say, I think in Ireland, I think we might be about to deal with quite a lot of good publishing, which would be a very good development. Catherine, I see you there now. Your novels, come out from New Ireland, and they also published, I forget, something Toohey, another queer book just this year. So it may be that Irish publishers are, dare we say, catching up and actually about to develop queer lists. That would be fantastic. So we hopefully see a huge expansion of representation, and we'll be everywhere, and we'll really enjoy it.
So now you're going to give out about Sally Rooney?
No, I'm not going to give out about Sally Rooney. It's more the publishers, and it's important, I think. She's a really brilliant, extremely clever writer. What I object to, and I heard this all the time before I actually got to see the book, is that conversation with friends, had lesbians in it, Now, if she didn't say there were lesbians, nobody in the world would have guessed they're lesbians, because they've broken up before the novel starts, and unlike any lesbians I've ever met, they're just cool friends. They go off to a dinner party together, and one of them falls straight away for the husband of the woman who's the best friend, the straight woman who's invited them over to dinner, and just like very, very rude. And, the girlfriend who just stopped being a girlfriend like last week doesn't mind at all. And there isn't a word that suggests that they were ever closely intimate, even emotionally close. There's nothing of the closeness of two women who really are best friends. There's no jealousy, there's no rivalry, there's no competition, there's no sharing, there's no confidence, there's nothing. You're just told that they're lesbians, And obviously the publishers wanted that as a selling point. You put in these characters, and I'm sure, that was the first book, wasn't it? The publishers said, well, we have to jazz this up a bit, You've got one of them falls in love with the husband of her friend. So what's the other one doing if you've got this other one hanging around, We'll make her the ex, And of course the ex who doesn't have a girlfriend or doesn't figure is absolutely stunningly beautiful, which is even more peculiar, I cannot imagine a stunningly beautiful lesbian who's just broken up going around Dublin and not meeting anybody else. And she doesn't, because the book covers about 3 years, and she still hasn't met anybody else. I mean, did you ever hear of it, So that's the kind of outright lying, disguised truth that is so infuriating. And it is important because this is going to happen more and more. Publishers want something tarted up a bit, We'll stick in a bit about drugs, or we stick in a bit about the poor, or the blacks in Ireland. Don't have anything to say about blacks in Ireland. Stick in a lesbian, that's great, because that's become bourgeois and cool now. It's acceptable, won't ruffle any feathers, but it'll still get listed, in every review. Because Sally Rooney's book, I don't know how many reviews I counted, at least 10, said, story about lesbians, features lesbians. And many of my friends, straight friends, ran to me with the book, and said, oh God, there are lesbians in it. So, we've got to ask for more than that, don't we? We really have to ask for more than that. And just to say that it's not as if nobody's ever written about these things before. When I was in France, which is probably what was such a help to me, I read Simone de Beauvoir, Violette Leduc, and who's the other one? There's another famous one. Colette, thank you. And even our wonderful Edna O'Brien. Edna O'Brien had a play with lesbians in it, and she had a novel with real love affair in it, The High Road. And the 3 French ones I mentioned are just fabulous. I mean, you can't approve of them. They're just wonderful. And they were doing that in their 60s, in the 60s, So it's just silly to say that there were never lesbian writers, It's that they were hidden from us in Ireland, like everything else. And now that finally we're out of the covers, literally out of the covers, we have to be on the covers. And it's sexy to mention a lesbian, but don't say anything about it. Just call them lesbians. It'll sell. Oh, sorry. Oh, you don't know. Okay.
I'm not sure I have much more to add. I personally feel that anybody, and Mary and I have had this discussion, everybody should be allowed to write anything they want. But I'm not sure that everybody is equally entitled to be published. And I think that's the issue. It's about publishing the voices from within the minority communities. I mean, we've had things like The Help, American Dirt. There was an English vicar who represented himself as an Asian girl growing up in the north of England. And thankfully, those publishers, the publishers of that particular book, pulped it before it came out when they found out that actually he wasn't a young Asian girl writing her first memoir. So I do feel very strongly that while it's lovely that Anne Enright is writing about things and Sally Rooney, that there has to be some sort of, I mean, especially when so many publishers in Ireland are funded, part funded by O'Corn Lane, the Arts Council, that there should be some sort of targets that they have to meet. I spoke to the Arts Council and asked them about this, and they said, we only ask for policies. We don't actually specify any numbers or anything like that. And I do think that's one area that could be improved vastly.
Couldn't see the haunted forest for the trees regarding our gender identity and sexuality. When there's no place like home, empty air, an empty establishment. Friends with Dorothy, fighting for your civil rights